Welcome to Regulated Roots, the series that takes you behind the scenes of the cannabis industry's most influential brands and talented minds behind them. I'm your host, Kimberly Simms, and today I am thrilled to have Eric Goepel join me again to talk about the outcomes of the election. I had Eric on for our first show back in October. Eric is the founder and CEO of the Veterans Cannabis Coalition. It's a mouthful, and a government affairs professional with a proven track record for advocacy, public policy, and grassroots organizing. So now that the dust has settled a bit, I think we've all processed the election results. I would like to have Eric give us a breakdown. We're going to talk a little bit about what cannabis policy will look like with the GOP controlling all three branches of government, how that will impact our industry. We'll talk a little bit about the potential for some legislative changes and explore what's on the horizon. So we are going to dig in to the post-election landscape and unpack some of the biggest questions I certainly have. And I hope that they resonate with everyone watching as well. So for those of us who maybe didn't tune in October, Eric, would you just just introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background, and then we'll jump right in with Florida, man.
Sure. Thanks, Kim. My name is Eric Goepel, and I've been working in cannabis policy for about 7 years now, and I've worked on some of the major pieces of legislation that Congress has been considering around legalization, as well as working locally or more locally in California around compassionate donations and education under a state law called the Dennis Prohn and Brownie Mary Act. And in both of those capacities, I've had the opportunity and to work with a wide variety of stakeholders, in cannabis, from patients all the way up to members of Congress, and in that process, I think it's clear that there's a desire for change, but there's clearly not a good sense of what that change actually looks like, which I think is the question we're all trying to solve.
Yes. My mom coined a term that helped me and has helped me through life: anticipatory anxiety, right? Like, I think that's what the industry has right now. Shout out Deborah Simms, my mom. But it is true, right? Like, I feel so anxious. I'm almost like, let's just get things going. Let's get the machine moving and see what happens. So hopefully you'll be able to shed some light and maybe ease some of other people's anticipatory anxiety as well. But I want to start with talking about, honestly, one of the things that surprised me the most was what happened in Florida. And Florida is such a fun, interesting place to begin with. But in my opinion, by all measures, this really should have passed. There was a historic level of funding, rigorous advertising campaigns, and a Trump endorsement. I think, we have to look at the perception or reality that this measure was largely funded by the industry, which we haven't really seen before. We talked quite a bit about that extensively when we chatted in October. But DeSantis aggressively campaigned against Amendment 3, telling voters that it was written by self-interested companies that were hoping to corner the market. We can see that that's very likely a big reason why the measure in Ohio failed back in 2015, was it gave cultivation rights to a small group of people. But it did get 57% of the votes in Florida. For those who don't know, there's a threshold of 60% required for a constitutional amendment to pass. So, what do you think? Like, let's unpack Florida, if one can.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's largely has to do with the 60% threshold. I mean, that's a very high threshold for any issue or candidate to meet. And I was just looking back. California's Prop 64 passed by 57%. Colorado's also Prop 64 back in 2012, which legalized adult use, I think, passed by 55%. So if 60% was the what was required, for adult use, we would see probably almost no adult use states.
Right. Yeah.
So this was a result of the fact that the legislature in Florida seemed very disinterested in doing anything to set up an adult use market, and so the players the powers that be in the cannabis industry in Florida decided to use the constitutional amendment route to open up adult use. Now, lots of issues. It can only be a single issue. It clearly benefited the existing, players within the Florida, medical market, and the Florida medical market from its outset was already one of the most restricted and clearly, jury rigged type markets to begin with. Where I think three cultivators got like vertical licenses, and you had to be a nursery in operation for more than 30 years at the time. And, and the fact that Kim Rivers' husband, ended up, implicated in a lot in corruption related to that issue, and had to do federal time. So, I mean, there's, all that's in play in Florida, right? This isn't like, some area of just disinterested free market, at play. So, handful of powerful, obviously wealthy operators in the state, were, made, I think, what was a compromise, offered a compromise to the public and saying, like, obviously we're going to benefit from this, but so will every adult in the state, which, I'd say in a lot of people's minds, and 50% of, people's minds, that was a fair compromise.
Yeah.
Now, obviously it wasn't enough to meet that 60%. And that's really not a reflection necessarily of a weak campaign, especially as you mentioned, the fact that the governor was using the power of the state and his office and money from the state to counter lobby that campaign.
Yes.
And was also cutting a deal, with the intoxicating hemp sector in the state, because, we can talk about the Farm Bill later, and basically this wave of states all banning intoxicating hemp or, hemp derived THC in any detectable amounts in red states, blue states. The state of Florida was on track to do exactly that. And the legislature passed that bill, and it was vetoed by the governor. So I would say that seems like a pretty clear quid pro quo, between the governor and the hemp industry to basically ice out the small set of multi-state operators that dominate the medical market, and obviously would have had a huge leg up going into adult use. So who's blameless in this mix? It's a lot of very conflicted interests, all basically, putting, I think, public interest to the wayside, because none of these things truly meet what the public needs, right? Which they need affordable, safe access, right? Are they getting that with the current medical market? No. Are they getting that with intoxicating hemp and the sort of deregulated, unregulated hemp space? No, they're not getting that. So both sides, you could say, are failing to meet the need at the moment.
I feel like the impact of the hemp industry on the failure of Amendment 3 didn't really get a lot of airtime, to be honest. Like, it was buried in a lot of different articles that I read, but I would have loved to see that fleshed out a little bit more.
And who's to say how much impact they really had in the end, right?
Well, right.
I mean, again, 57% still is a great margin in almost any other context politically, except in this very specific one.
So do you think that I know the answer, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask. Is there a world in which Florida lawmakers enact the will of the voters and
Sure. I mean, I guess anything's possible, right? So, I mean, especially when it comes to the what's law and what isn't, right? But it's clear, like, they've had, Florida medical went into play 2012. It's been around for a while.
A minute here,
They've had a long time to consider, how they would transition into an adult use market, and they've just really not spent any time, effort, or to really do that. So from the perspective of the public, the legislature is disinterested in doing it the right way, right? Yeah. And so, the industry pursued the one avenue that they had, essentially through a constitutional amendment. They made that play. It didn't work out, clearly, and it cost a lot of money in the process. But it wasn't necessarily a bad play to make in the grand scheme of things, right? Like,
truly might feel
Well, I mean, it looks, it's all bad in hindsight, right? Because it's like, oh, what could we have done with that $150 million?
So what do you
That we
think
put into that.
is that, and their involvement obviously, like, it raised concerns about market
Sure.
fairness. And that's a fair
As it
point.
should, yeah. I mean, they're a
Yeah.
major player. I mean, they have a disproportionate, they have a disproportionate market share within the state of Florida, at least.
Do you think
Um,
there's going to be any like overall impact to them as a company, or they just kind of like brush their shoulders off and
I don't know. There's not a lot of companies that can take a $150 million hit like that. And again, there's no ROI on this, right? So
right,
it's not like they bought assets that they can turn around and sell. Like
right.
they just spent money on TV ads and political consultants, and obviously a lot of people that took a lot of money from them,
Yeah.
and gave them something. I mean, clearly, but I mean, again, from my very superficial understanding, it didn't look like the campaign was run particularly poorly. So, and
No.
again, they got the 57%, and it's and they had to go up against the very kind of unheard of, where the governor was willing to
Yeah.
use the bully pulpit of his office plus state funds essentially to target them.
Yes,
So
that is
that's
unusual.
that's a huge obstacle in almost any given any scenario, let alone in this one. So
Florida, man. That's all we can say. I mean, yeah, I 60%. It's tough. It's tough.
numbers are
Well,
not, yeah. I mean, it's the votes, man. Like obviously, if turnout was different, if who knows, right? Like,
right. Yeah. Well, it certainly is a disappointment for me. It was a disappointment for, I think, 57% of Floridians. Um, and I would imagine quite a disappointment for True Leave. So
yeah.
I guess we will just have to stay tuned and see what happens next. I want to touch like super briefly on Nebraska. I know we touched on it just a little bit last time as well. Um, there were so many legal challenges to even get to the ballot initiative. And again, for folks that might be a little bit more interested in that, please go back and watch our October segment where I laid out what was happening there. But in November, it looks like more than 70% of voters approved the medical marijuana regulations. And then a few days ago, the governor signed the proclamation. And that happened just a few days after the county district court actually tossed out an injunction filed over the vote that attempted to block the governor from signing the proclamation on the marijuana initiatives. And instead said, no, the matters have to, make their way through the courts. But now the Nebraska Supreme Court has decided to expedite the appeal of the lawsuit seeking to invalidate the state's incoming marijuana laws. So listen, like, this industry is no stranger to challenges, but how do you think that all shakes out? And again, just spending a few minutes, because I think it's so interesting in Nebraska in particular. We really do see that interplay between, politics, policy, and law, and how they can either work together or be polarizing. So what do again, just super briefly, like, what are Nebraskans to do?
I mean, this is definitely a situation where the state legislature, governor, and Supreme Court all seem, pretty set in figuring out how to undermine whatever the voters turn back, or whatever the voters approve. So, I mean,
Mhm.
this is basically, they're going to do it if they don't feel like there's any consequence politically for them, you know. So we've seen kind of two different versions of this. I would say one version was Oklahoma,
Okay.
where after the voters approved what now, truthfully, was probably a much broader medical market than what anyone really anticipated, just like descheduling of hemp, right? It created a lot of unintended consequences came out of Oklahoma medical.
Mhm.
Truly. Yeah, that's fair. Now, but basically that was the letter of the law, right, as approved by the voter. And then the legislature tried to come in and you know and play and basically undermine it, got caught, got taken to court, and basically had to back off and had to basically let it roll out as written, which
Mhm.
again created this very free market. I mean, Oklahoma was certainly considered one of the freest of cannabis markets because very easy to cultivate, very easy to get licensed. Land was cheap, labor was cheap, inputs, materials, all cheap, right?
Yeah.
And you're positioned smack dab in the middle of the country. So,
Yep.
and who's to say whether all your product stays in the state or not? But hey, you're well positioned to move it if it didn't.
Which we should not be doing, listeners.
Well, I mean, the interstate commerce has always been in place. It's just never been. It's been variously, illegal over time.
But it is a legal podcast. So
the post office is the biggest drug trafficker in the world, right? They've moved more drugs in their history than Pablo Escobar, El Chapo, right? None of these guys come close, right? Let's be real. Yep, So I mean, that's the reality, right? Like, we have interstate commerce, Oklahoma, their medical market, the way it developed. Yes, obviously a lot of issues there, but what it did do was create a huge and a huge level, a good layer of affordable access for a lot of people in that state. And again, going back to and the legislator had tried to interfere with that, and they were unsuccessful, and then it basically rolled out as written. Now, the opposite would be like Mississippi, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska, where the legislature, the Supreme Court, the governor have all taken various steps to either disqualify a ballot initiative or call into question its validity after the fact, after it's already been approved. Basically finding some kind of legal precedent or justification to invalidate the will of the voters. And again, they're going to continue to do that until they face some kind of political consequence for that, which means that voters are going to have to vote them out or protest, or again, and it's not easy. I get that, right? Like, this isn't as an issue. This isn't as motivating as it used to be. And we're getting into kind of like the red wall states that it's going to be an uphill battle. But this is why we need federal legalization as well, right? Can't rely on Kansas and Idaho to come along with the rest of the country and deny their millions of citizens access to a safe, what could be a safe, affordable, and beneficial drug, right? Mm-hmm. There's no justification for that. I mean, we can try to make justifications for it, but cannabis is an alcohol.
But the children, right?
Right. Yeah. So there's a level of legal access that should be guaranteed to all citizens, no matter what state they're in. And we're now running into kind of the limits of states of the laboratories of democracy, where you're seeing how states with different laws and, whether it's a 60% threshold for an amendment or something that allows for, the courts or the legislature to kind of, come in after the fact and again, invalidate voter will.
Yeah.
Those are all little permutations of, how states have developed their laws over time. Not every state gives the same level of authority to the public or the plebiscite, like California versus like Texas, where that process does not even exist in any state, in any form, at least as far as I know. So, there's, again, we're kind of, again, just we're hitting the end of this phase, I think, of legalization, where the easy wins at the state level.
Yeah. I hadn't really even thought about that, just purely from a blue-red. We've got the low-hanging fruit now.
Half the country is adult use. I mean, that's pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, not that half the country is low-hanging fruit, but interesting. Yeah. Well, so I mean, I will be keeping an eye on that, on Nebraska for sure, see how it all plays out. Let's switch gears. I would love to talk, about federal level, and we break this down into a couple different questions. But Trump won, and so that's where we are at this moment in time. I guess I want to start with a super general question, and then I want to talk a little bit about rescheduling and some of the appointments that he's making, and that. But just speaking really broadly, with the election results in mind, and I guess it's all three branches of government now. What do you think what do you think the likelihood of legalization or decriminalization is? You think that there's any chance? I don't think the GOP is really super excited to push this agenda forward. And yet here we are. We can't have no progress for the next 4 years. So what do you, just again, super general. And
I
then
mean, the
we'll talk a little
unfortunate
bit.
thing is, like
Yeah,
veteran advocacy is a great teacher of just showing how long it can take for something that is seemingly both morally justified, cost saving. Like there's so many veteran issues that the community has dealt with that have taken decades
yeah,
to get resolution on. So for the idea of like, oh, could we not see could we not see progress for 4 years? Most definitely.
yeah. It just
Never underestimate Congress's ability to not do something. Like,
yeah.
inertia is always leaning toward rest in the case of Congress. It's not motion, it's not in movement.
Yeah. It
Uh,
just feels like a gut punch though, because I feel like, last year or even looking at 2023, we had such, it seemed like positive momentum. Um, so now it just feels not great.
well, I mean, the momentum I think was largely, I think this was something, the industry and the community, perhaps to some extent, like we cannot delude ourselves, right? We've now seen with rescheduling how it can go down the exact same procedural rabbit hole as almost any other issue, based on
So
who's in
it's
power,
not
like
moving. Yeah.
who's leaning on it, who's not. It was clear from the rescheduling process within the Biden administration that the DEA was obviously not on board with rescheduling, but because the Attorney General, in this case Merrick Garland, uh, had the DEA's powers delegated from the Attorney General, so the Attorney General doesn't actually need to listen to the DEA if they don't need to, they don't want to ultimately. But
Well, so
again, if it was
yeah.
different Attorney General, different president, but even in the context of where this is an executive branch action that is taken, it's going to take more than 2 years, and it could take two more. There's no time limit basically
Yeah.
on when these hearings are going to, these hearings are going to happen to when the DEA finally publishes that final rule. Like that, that could be essentially indefinite.
People
Uh,
were so excited, and like I think we might have talked about this. I can't recall. But how it sparked so much optimism, and people were like, "Oh yeah, by next year, 280E is going to be gone." And I was like, I mean, yes, let's celebrate this moment. It's worth celebrating, but everyone like pump the brakes. Like this is not happening overnight
no,
by any
and
stretch of
it's
the
still,
imagination.
well, I mean, and this is, I think, whether it's like rescheduling or safer banking, like these things are all pitched as like, oh, these are good process victories. These are
Mhm.
necessary increments. And yet, right, safe banking is now in its second. It's going to be in its second decade in the next session.
Yeah. How many effing iterations have we seen of it?
Well,
I've lost count myself.
I mean, it's still roughly. I mean, it's still meat and potatoes,
Yeah,
or the bones are
but
still the same largely. I mean, and it's taken some. It's gone through some permutations as well. But
yeah,
yeah, at the same time, it's like this is not incremental anymore, right?
no, you're right.
Incremental is something that doesn't take 10 years to pass. So because obviously in that decade we went from 2 states being legal, having adult use legalization, to more than 20. I think we're at 26, 27 now.
Mhm.
um, More than half the country,
Yeah.
having adult use, and the bill. So I mean, like again, the momentum behind something like this changes because like the pressing need that it was trying to address 10 years ago isn't the same 10 years
Yeah.
on. It just
Yeah.
isn't. I mean,
Well, we'll dig into banking in a minute, but let's just talk like a little bit more in detail about rescheduling. So for our listeners, I'm just going to give like a quickie snapshot. So the hearing started on December 2nd. So following the preliminary hearing on December 2nd, the judge issued a pre-hearing ruling, which basically set the table for the next step, which is going to be the evidentiary hearings, which are supposedly going to be convened early next year. And that's obviously on the Department of Justice's proposed rulemaking to reschedule marijuana from Schedule 1 to 3. You can also, you can get a full list of who is going to be able to testify. And those hearings will commence on January 21st and continue daily from 9:30 to 5:30, Tuesday through Thursday of each week until March 6th. So, I think there will be quite a bit to be seen. but and I know there's been a ton of controversy in terms of like who's on that list to provide testimony and who's not.
I
But
mean,
what do you like? What do you think? I don't know. Shake your crystal ball. What do you think happens? You know, in two
it's like
months?
it's good process, it's necessary process, I
Sure.
guess, right?
Right.
Like, I mean, basically, this has to go. It's run its course,
Yeah.
but whatever outcome that's arrived at, whether it's Schedule 3, Schedule 2, Schedule 1, who whatever the final rulemaking is, it's still not going to be enough, and it still fails to address like 80-90% of, I say 95% of the actual issues that need to get resolved in order to move legalization forward, right?
Yeah.
So this is a sideshow in the same way that I think safe banking is a sideshow, right? Neither of
Yeah.
these issues fundamentally change market access or viability in the near or short term, right?
Yeah. So, well, again, like we
Yeah.
keep saying it, and I think people have, their rose-colored glasses on, or like I say to my kids, well, I don't say this, but I'm like, they really have selective hearing. Like you're just hearing what you want to hear.
I mean, I
And
get it, right? Like
oh yeah, you could listen.
we're all dealing with sunk cost fallacy here, right? I'm not a bag
Yeah,
holder in this industry. I own $0 in cannabis stocks because
same.
I have some sense of how this would work,
But
and I feel like if I'm gonna have a good idea of when things are gonna change. So like then I might change that position. But like right now, why would you ever invest in the same sense of like there's no way if it's almost impossible to make a profit legally,
yeah,
why would you ever invest in that unless you know that basically you're going to take a hit in the short run,
right.
which
I mean, I
now
think
10 years in, right? Like again, there's no more short runs. Like whatever green rush happened, it's run its course. The
yeah,
institutional investor money still years out.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Everybody's looking for signals and they're just not coming.
Well,
It's the same issue.
I think we all have to try to like hang on to a little bit of hope.
Oh, I
So
mean,
maybe
listen, I'm optimistic because I know what the plant's capable of, right? Like
right,
I,
but
I see I see the industry as looking at this through a straw hole, right?
mhm,
They see this tiny adult use market and they think that's the world. And I'm looking at no, it's like cannabis is a $1 trillion industry because it competes with pharma,
pharma,
tobacco, alcohol, and that collectively is $1 trillion just in this country alone, right?
yeah,
So if you got cannabinoids that can compete as an adult use, intoxicant, and
yep.
as 100 different or potentially thousands of different
You would
compounded drugs. I mean,
hardly know. I wish I wrote it down, but like I got caught in a rabbit hole the other night of reading. I wish I don't remember, but it was like a different cannabinoids that I had not heard of before,
yeah,
and it was
always new
talking
ones. I mean,
scouting.
I was learning.
Started with the C. It's shocking. You know,
CBC. I mean, that's a semi new one.
yeah, I don't know. I can't remember what it was, but I was just
Well,
it
they're new
just
to us
reminded
too,
me that
right? Like
we yeah.
the chemists have identified these things
Yes, it was a
for
very,
years and
very
decades.
sciencey article, so I probably, digested like half of it, but it just reminded me that like we are still barely at the tip of the iceberg when it comes to what this plant can do.
Well, I mean, just think about in terms of the pharmaceutical side, right?
Mhm,
Like it takes 10 years on average, $100 million to bring a new drug to market, let's say. And a lot
mhm.
of that money just gets spent on finding a compound that does something, and then B, a compound that doesn't immediately kill you, right?
Right, that's a important part.
Both really important parts in phase one and phase two. Does it do something? How dangerous is it? And then,
Right,
okay, does it actually do, something under some kind of controlled setting and deliver
mhm.
some like therapeutic effect better than placebo, right? Like
Right, right,
and that's like you're getting into your phase three, right? So all those different phases are important, and it's good to, and while I'm not, saying like we need to do everything through the FDA, but basically it's like those are all important questions to answer, and we already know the answer for cannabinoids on the first two questions. They all do
right.
something, and almost all of them, especially the naturally occurring ones, have such a low like risk threshold, risk profile that they're
Yeah,
essentially benign. Now,
yeah.
that's not to say THC in every permutation, again,
No, of
the
course not,
isomer
of course
analog
not.
of THC is going to be, the same. But let's just take THC out of the,
Mhm.
put that to the side and look at every other phytocannabinoid and say, okay, find me the cannabinoid of most risk.
Mhm.
Show me how or why that this, particular CBC or CBN or what have you, is any riskier than, ibuprofen, NSAIDs kill like 8 to 10,000 people a year, usually through gastrointestinal bleeds and liver kidney issues, right?
Whenever
So,
I watch live TV, which is like a rarity, I get you like at MJ BizCon, right? I'm in a hotel
right.
room, so I've just got like the TV on in the background as I'm getting ready for the day, and the commercials come on for different medications, and it's
Oh
like
yeah.
side effects may cause death, drowsiness, well dry. I'm like, what? And the list goes on and on and on, and then the commercial's over, and I'm like, what?
We're one of
Like,
2 countries in the world that do direct to consumer pharma advertising. The other
it's
being
like
New
the
Zealand. I
list
don't know
of
why
side
New Zealand
effects
just does that, but
the list of side effects are just like, sign me right up for that. Like, yeah,
well,
it's
I mean, and if you listen to, and as I
wild.
do, like I like to have the TV on in the background, and I still get ads served a lot, and I kind of and I make a mental note of the drugs that I see advertised, because obviously, if a pharma company is putting money into an advertising campaign, they believe it's a moneymaker, clearly.
Right, of course.
So and they're trying to hit a demographic that is basically doesn't have good access to something effective. So they're trying to offer, like, hey, whatever you've been taking in the past, forget it. This is
This
the
is that.
new thing, Humira
But
or
here's
whatever.
its 20, but here's its 20 side effects.
Right. Well, I mean, there's no
Of
drug that doesn't have side effects. All drugs have effects, right? Some we
course.
like,
But
some we don't. But
right, but when you look at it and
right.
it's like, you could take this or cannabis,
And that, but
right?
but I wouldn't be the one to say, like, oh, CBD can replace Humira, right? At the same
No,
time, though, like, I
we're
could
not saying
see
that, but
how a cannabinoid drug or a compound or a collection of cannabinoids in a pharmaceutical could be that kind of broad anti-inflammatory drug that doesn't carry anywhere close to the same risks. Right
mhm,
now, that drug, as far as I know, does not exist. Right, the cannabinoids that can make that drug already exist. They've
right.
existed for thousands, tens of thousands of years. We're just now kind of catching up to them. And I guess
Mm,
that's kind of the thing, right? Like, the
yeah.
pharmaceutical industry couldn't imagine what the cannabis plant holds, like, because it would cost them centuries,
Yeah.
billions, trillions of dollars to try to develop exactly what the plant basically already
Does.
contains.
Yeah.
It's really now just trying to figure out, like, okay, right? It has this kind of vague potential of being able to do almost anything, but trying to get it to do something specific becomes a much, a very significant challenge. So, and that
Yeah.
requires investment and research, and a lot of work. So, but that's the future. Is like,
Yeah, I think
why would
so.
you you would see cannabinoids as a by themselves with other cannabinoids, or with looking at other drug synergies. Why wouldn't you do
Yeah.
THC and in an opioid together to create, if you can do, a certain amount of
Yeah.
THC spares like higher dose opioids, but you get a superior analgesic effect than just THC or opioids alone, right, without the
Mhm.
same risk of solely opioid. Or they love to throw opioids and NSAIDs together to destroy your liver, while at the same time making you constipated or whatever.
So fun.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Is there a better option out there? I'd like to think so. Yeah,
I hope
I
so.
believe so. Yeah, of
All right. We've veered off topic a little,
course.
which is fine, of course. Because I think what we just chatted about has a lot of merit, and it's part of the overall discussion about rescheduling or descheduling altogether. But I do want to switch gears, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the appointments that we're seeing. So just a quick viewer note, we are recording this in December, December 16th. So things are changing, rapidly. So just sort of like context that this conversation is happening in December, and this will be airing probably in February. But I think I would love to start with Attorney General and Assistant Attorney General here. So we've got Pam Bondi. Is that how we say her last name? And then Hermeet Dillon. Um, you know, I, I feel like I have more concerns about Assistant Attorney General personally. Just reading some of her comments, like she's real into the gateway drug theory. She's been quoted as saying people who consume marijuana are silly, boring, and smelly. I would like to say that I am silly. I am sometimes boring, but I shower regularly.
That's
And
just the
she's
human
also
condition, right? I
right.
mean,
And she's also said the real locus of most drug possession crimes is in state laws. I agree that people should not be behind bars for being drug addicts, but I disagree that we should minimize or even glorify drug use, much less use it to pander for votes. And then I know Bondi opposed efforts to legalize medical marijuana, but then shifted a bit in enacting some of that actual regulation. So, you know, I'm no fan of Matt Gaetz, but he was, for purposes of cannabis, a good choice. For purposes of everything else,
yeah. Well, it's again, this is, whether Bondi and Dylan end up, getting confirmed or not.
right?
I just, the expectation shouldn't be that the Department of Justice is ever going to be pro legalization, right? It is just,
It's like
I mean, and
antithetical
that's
to the
that's red,
entire.
that's Republican or
Yeah.
Democrat, right? Like it's an institution, and the
Mhm.
federal judiciary and the federal law enforcement, uh, they're not pro legalization. I mean, that's just, again, so the expectation, shouldn't be that like we're gonna have to rely on the attorney general to make cannabis legal, right? It's Congress. Congress is the one responsible for it. Congress is gonna have to pass the laws. Whether we might be, whether or not they do a new call memo, or maybe lean on whoever ends up being the DEA, the DEA administrator to
Do we have
continue on with rescheduling.
a pick for that? I know that they were.
Chad Cronister had to withdraw, and after that, I haven't seen any new
I haven't
names
seen it. Yeah, I haven't seen
proposed.
anything
So,
either.
or yeah, I haven't seen any names for ONDCP either. But both of those are, I mean, honestly, like it's really, and again,
That's just
it
for
really goes
people
back to the AG though,
who
right? Like,
Office of National Drug Control Policy Director. You threw those letters out there super
sure.
fast, but if people, I just want them to make sure that they know what we're
Yeah,
talking about.
it's the White House. It's a White House office that is supposed to coordinate federal drug policy and response. Um, again, it doesn't have any like real statutory authority. I mean, the DEA does certainly, but that authority itself is delegated by the AG. So the AG ultimately is the top law enforcement
Right.
official in the U.S. and they do have a good deal of authority when it comes to scheduling.
Mm-hmm.
So the AG can act independently of the DEA.
But you
As
don't
far as
think
I
there's
know.
a world in which we see that happening?
Yeah, but again, right? Like, so it would take a very independent AG, or an AG that's been empowered by the president, that's been given the clearance to do
Go
this
ahead.
work on this issue. So if you think of Trump at the head of this, like the head of this top of this pyramid here, right? If the signal comes down from the top that this cannabis legalization or descheduling is going to be the position of the Department of Justice, I would expect the AG would probably fall in line. I don't expect that the Trump is going to brook a lot of dissidence within his top officials. But again, that presumes that he makes it an issue.
Right.
Right.
Okay, I want to switch gears. I don't think we can have this conversation without talking about the pick for Health and Human Services.
Sure. RFK
Jr. Jr. Let's chat about,
I mean, it's like I can't, you can't listen to these people too much. You really just have to look at what they do. And again, what's within the authority of the Secretary of Health and Human Services to do. As far as cannabis goes, they've basically played their hand, right?
Mhm.
Now, there's research and there's like support, there's elements or moves that HHS can make to basically make the department more supportive of cannabis in some way, shape, or form. Again, whether that's actually spending new money on research or coming out with like favorable or just less biased government analyses of the issue. Again, HHS already put together a 300-page report basically detailing all the reasoning why it was recommending cannabis to reschedule to 3. So it's already put its official opinion basically out into the world, And it's very solidly in favor of like, hey, 40,000 doctors are already prescribing this, right? Like there's a high level of accepted medical use for cannabis, regardless of what the federal government is saying right now, right? Actual licensed physicians treating actual people are using cannabis in vivo, right? This isn't a notional or hypothetical here.
Yeah.
And they looked at that, and they looked at the the outcomes, and they looked at as much as they are able to, right? And they looked at like things better or worse, right? Like again, it's not like them saying cannabis is a panacea or a cure-all for anything, but it is HHS recognizing that cannabis is a medicine and that it's used as a medicine in nearly every jurisdiction in this country.
Yeah.
So I mean that's something. I don't know what more RFK can really do beyond that. Again, just driving research dollars, maybe.
Entertain us a bit, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, just striking a more overall positive message when it comes to talking about cannabis.
I mean, I think that would be progress. I feel like a little bit. Problem is, it's hard to take him seriously. What about?
It's just like, there's other things he's going to do too, right? Like, so
well,
whatever. I think that might be. Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, like, we talked about this, I know, extensively, and it's a conversation I have constantly, that just cannabis reform is one of the most important things to us inside the industry. But when you are just a regular layperson living your life, that's not top of mind. It's not your top issue. It's not going to drive you to make decisions on politicians one way or the other. And that is just the reality of it. What do you think about Doug Collins for head of Department of Veterans Affairs? I think he's got kind of a spotty record regarding marijuana reform.
Most Republicans, you could probably just assume like the default is like
no thanks,
hesitant to hostile.
Yeah. Well, that's my next question is like, all right, we've got GOP House and Senate. Who, if anyone, is positioned to push cannabis reform forward? Like historically, we know that Republicans have opposed full legalization, and I would imagine that a Republican-controlled Congress is likely to resist efforts and progress for reform.
Well, they don't have to resist anything, right? Like John Thune and Mike Johnson, basically they control the schedule. They control what bills are going to get to the floor and what bills aren't. And is John Thune from South Dakota and Mike Johnson from Louisiana, two people who have made many negative statements about cannabis, are they going to do anything for cannabis? No. So it goes back to like the AG issue. All this could change if President Trump decides that he's going to make this a priority for his administration, but nothing will change if that doesn't happen.
I just can't imagine that he will, right? I mean,
again, like the way I'm looking at this, especially in the current moment, is if with the Republican, trifecta between the Supreme Court, Congress, and the executive branch, they're going to be able to get a lot of what they want to do done, probably in the first 6 months. Now, the question becomes, what they get done, is that going to create a massive political and voter backlash? I think it very well could, because a lot of the things that they want to get done, and because they kind of have the wind at their back, they think they have a mandate necessarily, to do a lot more than maybe they do. And maybe they bite off more they can chew, and maybe they tackle too many issues simultaneously that are just too politically damaging. And so then they have to drop some, and then they have to reposition and basically figure out like, okay, we need to win back the public. Trump's all about optics and perception. Yeah. And so what issue could they attach themselves to that would both embarrass the Democrats, because they get to like take it from them if they want, while also basically throwing a populist bone to the American people. Now, to your point, is it really going to make that much of a difference if cannabis becomes legal at the national level? I don't know. Like, I don't know if that's going to be powerful enough to outweigh the, reproductive rights and immigration and like all taxes and Social Security and like all these other things, this very long laundry list of priorities that the incoming administration has. And they want to tackle it all. They want to do it quickly. Because, I mean, basically they got to run for, everyone's running for election again in 2 years in the House. Which means that they're going to be running on whatever the next 2 years
Whatever.
look like,
Yeah.
and that could be very bad for a lot of competitive districts. If you got to come back to an R+3 or R+5 district, and then basically have to own whatever your party just did under a unified government, because there's no Democrats left to blame, essentially, right? Like they're out of power. They don't have the majority in the House.
No.
I mean, they can still block some stuff in the Senate because obviously Republicans don't have 60 votes,
Right.
a 60 vote majority. But at the same time,
it's like
yeah.
For my Broadway fans out there who like Hamilton, you don't have the votes. people who know Hamilton will see you guys.
It's all about vote counting. It's like where people are, right? And it's generally not a mystery in most cases.
No.
So if they haven't made it, yeah.
What about all right, let's talk a little bit about, and we have already, but just like circle back to banking and financial services. So I was reading the other day that I know FinCEN obviously like tracks cannabis banking trends. But what I was reading is that in the last year, that in the past, so FinCEN's been tracking these trends for the past decade, and its latest report for the second quarter of 2024 showed a record high with 831 banks and credit unions reporting their active involvement in banking cannabis companies, and that's up from prior years, obviously. So, you've got a record number of banks that are now reporting that they're working with state legal businesses. You've got, had increased pressure from Congress to enact broader protections for financial institutions. So is there a world in which maybe banking and financial services are more available?
I try to look up, I don't know a ton about French Hill, but he's going to be the incoming House chair of the House Financial Services Committee. And Mike Crapo is likely going to be the Senate Banking Committee chair. So they both have, again, they're not anti-safe banking as far as I can tell. Again, I wouldn't really call myself an expert on the Republican politics of this, but their public statements, I think, have basically leave at least a door open for them to consider it. But again, it doesn't matter if John Thune or Mike Johnson isn't going to bring a statement bill to a vote.
Yeah.
And so then that turns into, okay, well, if you can't get a standalone bill to the floor, then you're going to have to try to attach it. And then you're just now back into what we've seen for the last 10 years, which is various attempts to attach it to things and it getting stripped out literally at every other turn, right? Or in the end, just not making it through, over the finish line, because you can pass the House a million times, but if it never gets taken up in the Senate.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, it's been stuck in committees so many times. So, well, let's close it out with a little bit of a chat on the Farm Bill. So, senior agricultural lawmakers are still, at least as of a few days ago, battling over a deal to extend the current Farm Bill, the 2018 Farm Bill, for another year. The current bill expires December 31st of this year.
Right.
What do you still got testing labs that aren't being able to meet the DEA requirements or receiving certification. So we've got another year of hemp farmers, not having to test their crops at federally approved labs. And then I was reading, I guess this was like a month ago, but I fell behind on my hemp news, but there's a senator from Ohio who introduced a version of the Farm Bill that would alter the federal definition of hemp to distinguish it from industrial hemp in an effort to close some of those loopholes that we've been talking about. And I think that's called the Rural Prosperity and Food Security Act of 2024. And I guess that was introduced in November, past November, so a month ago. So I don't know. What do you think happens to the Farm Bill? I think we can't end a segment, a post-mortem of the election without talking about the Farm Bill. So what do you think? What are your predictions for what we see happening there?
So, I mean, the Farm Bill is the most substantive piece of legislation impacting cannabis in the next 2 years, clearly,
I
right?
would agree.
It created the hemp industry as we know it with 4 or 5 lines in 2018, you know, and of course the unintended consequences, Congress not being experts or chemists or any of these things, not really understanding what it means to deschedule hemp derivatives,
Right, right, right,
which
right.
has now been, which is a loophole that's been now expanded to, claim everything from THCA and, high concentrations of Delta 9. Again, stuff that was clearly never intended.
Right.
Now,
That was
that's
like
not
the proverbial, we give an inch, you take a mile.
right. But again, it's not like, this is how our economy, our markets and economies function, right? Like if people see an opportunity, they're going to take it. And if there's no one telling them no or telling them they can't do it a certain way, they're going to do it however they please, and largely that's going to be dependent on what thing they think most likely to deliver profit and reduce their cost.
Right.
And very often that is not something that benefits the consumer, and certainly not patients. So the hemp industry has kind of taken advantage of the a lot of the work that the the cannabis legalization movement has made in establishing cannabis as a medicine and then turning around and selling something that is clearly not that. Now, that's not to say that there aren't real medicines being sold by hemp companies. There is, most definitely.
Of course,
There
of
are
course.
very high quality hemp products that contain, even trace amounts or even higher amounts of THC that certainly are comparable to something like Epidiolex, right? Which is produced, is considered a pharmaceutical. So the potential, hemp is a medicine, hemp cannabinoids are medicine. The source is clearly, an issue. And this arbitrary distinction between hemp and marijuana, just based on THC percentage, is exactly that. It's arbitrary, which means it can change.
Weight and all that. Yeah.
Right. There's no commandment out there saying that hemp is defined as 0.3% THC by weight. Right. That is purely a legal creation. Yep. And the fact that it remains is, that again, that's a choice. Now, problem is Congress is going to be far less interested in expanding the amount of THC in hemp than they are in closing all of these other loopholes created, that intoxicating hemp cannabinoids have essentially created. Everyone, Republicans and Democrats both, and it's emergency ban in California. You've got the California governor and Illinois governor and legislature coming out in favor of banning Delta 8. Ohio and Texas both going the same routes. Texas wants to ban all THC, right? Again, and this is all coming from the top. So, and these are the senior elected officials in these states, basically are aligned behind closing the hemp loopholes. So,
I mean, that's why the regulatory, we didn't talk about this last time, or maybe we touched on it, but the Chevron decision, that is why these regulatory bodies are so important, because to your point, there's so much science and expertise that goes into what we're talking about, and policymakers don't have that level of expertise.
Policymakers don't have it. Staff don't have it. I mean, maybe some committee professionals, but again, Congress is mostly made up of lawyers, right? They're not physical scientists.
Yeah,
they're
not
necessarily business owners. Yeah.
We know what we know.
They have a certain perspective. And while it can be very valuable, it is certainly not complete.
Absolutely not.
So what we have though with the Farm Bill is basically it's currently on the track of Prohibition 2.0. All the political momentum is around closing the hemp loopholes, the intoxicating hemp loopholes, and further restricting basically the market that was created as a result of descheduling in 2018. So all of that is going. It's now a question of what is the final end result going to look like, because as it currently stands, that market is not going to exist in 2 years. It is going to be very different.
It will. It'll just
it'll
be,
But you don't have the fig leaf of selling THCA flower across state lines or any of this other, these other contortions that these companies are doing. And it's just you're not fooling anybody. like you're basically the only people you're really trying to fool are consumers, which
Right.
in my mind gives you no high ground, right? Like
No.
if you're betraying consumer trust, or you're selling them something that isn't what you say it is, then you're committing fraud, right? And you don't have any protection in my mind, if you're
Yeah.
choosing to do that. So then that's the reality, is that so many of hemp operators are committing fraud on some level, in the public. The products are not accurately measured, accurately weighed. They have contaminants. They have other cannabinoids that they're not supposed to have. How many companies have gotten sued over THC content in their CBD only products, right?
Yep.
Because they have poor input control, and again, a variety of business practices kind of might explain why. But the end result is that's the basic element of like a regulated market, is like people get what they pay for, and you tell them exactly what's in the thing so they know what they're getting. And if you can't do that, then maybe you don't deserve. I mean, basically, it's like not you don't have a right to just sell garbage into the public space just because you want to. I mean, that doesn't work either. So there's got to be some standard that these products are held to, and that's that's the opportunity.
And I don't think most people are opposed to that. But again, it's these these emergency bans that we're seeing that I find to be so problematic.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, this is the government reaction, right? Like it's every problem's a nail and they're a giant hammer, and
but it's just
prohibition
lazy.
is the way.
Like actually, I think prohibition is like the laziest way to govern.
Oh, of course. Yeah. But I mean, why wouldn't? But we're kind of like, but you see why they choose this way. It is the easiest way because it doesn't require.
It doesn't actually solve the yes, of course, but it doesn't actually solve the problem. No. And much like the we saw back in 2011 or maybe 2012 when like the 4 district attorneys in California, they sent out like all these letters to all the landlords threatening that they were going to, utilize asset forfeiture to, to take their properties of anyone that was leasing to any cannabis business. And it did have a chilling effect for a few months.
Everybody's called
the like the cat's out of the bag. Like I remember like being like, WTF should be like, what the Fed? Like, it's not like the cat's out of the bag, genie's out of the bottle, however you want to, whatever euphemism you want to use. And so I think that's, I mean, that's the problem.
I mean, you're never going to, I mean, you're right. I mean, this is in California's a good example. The ban basically was followed by companies that have something to lose and that have, a lot of market presence or a lot of, public exposure, like Total Wine, Bevmo. So it's easy, so it's easy to get them to pull THC beverages off their shelves, but, try to get every head shop, convenience store, gas station to pull. I mean, again, they're already selling a chemical soup of products that have no regulation attached to them to begin with. So adding, synthetic cannabinoids into that mix is just okay. That's easy, right? They already got a channel for all that.
Do I think a lot of these smaller places have it? Not all, like not a head shop necessarily, but like the convenience stores, they don't know. They're like, there's a consumer demand. I'm putting it on my shelves. It's disappearing from my shelves. I'm reordering it. Like I doubt that they have a full understanding of what it is that they're even, selling.
Oh, I'm sure. I mean, and again, right, it just goes to, it underlines like why this industry and this sector is so shaky is because like no one knows what they're selling. No one knows what they're buying. Like no one knows how legal any of this is, if it is legal. And again, the level of legality is always a shifting, it's a shifting line in the sand.
You think it's easier to be at least in California, it's easier to be a marijuana operator than a hemp operator, I think.
I mean, maybe now. Like, at least you have a way to market. Like with hemp, like if you have detectable THC in your hemp products, there is no market for you anymore.
Right.
Like, you are completely closed out.
At least here, like with marijuana, like this is what you need to do. These are the steps you need to take. Local approval, state approval. And it's mostly, set in stone. Obviously, we're still having the DCC come in and change and amend and adopt. But I when I am counseling my marijuana clients, I feel confident and resolute, and I know I'm giving them the correct answers. Now you shift over to hemp, and I'm like, what? And ingestible products, obviously, that's what we're mainly focusing on. It's different for topicals and things of that nature. But I'm like, well, it's more of a risk assessment, and it's so I find, again, just as an attorney, that I have a much easier time with my marijuana clients than my hemp. I just do, because the answers are clear and I can, there's clear lines in the sand, whereas such is not the case on the hemp side.
Well, I mean, it's, I mean, again, what needs to happen is like this, the standards for hemp obviously need to come up, right? Because
Mhm.
currently there are basically none.
Well, right, there's
But,
zero parity
right.
in the yeah.
So like, but at the same time, like the level of, taxation and regulation imposed on legal cannabis operators, especially like in California, needs to come
Mhm.
way down. Like, and
Yes.
it needs to be comparable with alcohol and tobacco, because
Yes,
again,
yes, yes,
the
yes.
state doesn't distinguish between adult use and medical anymore.
Mm-mm.
So but it can't, but it's treating adult use THC like it's some super drug rather than something that is actually far less risky and harmful than alcohol or tobacco, right?
Preach. Yeah. Yeah. Man. Well, okay, we're just at an hour here. So let's try and end on a hopeful note.
Go after the
Share
farm bill.
the
like,
farm bill. Yeah, guys.
like that's where the action is in the next 2 years,
Yes.
right? So
Okay.
until the farm bill gets solidified, it's an open book to create what could be the future for legalization, because it's getting away from this hemp, marijuana, cannabis, false, trichotomy, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah. That's a great way to
It's
put
all the
it.
cannabis plant. We're
Yep.
talking about, and if we're talking about compounds and their intended end use, then regulate based on that, not based on where it came from, other
Yes.
than maybe banning synthetic. I mean, again, not a huge fan of
Sure.
synthetics when
No,
you
I
have
mean,
options.
there's but let's properly
Right.
regulate it. I
And
think
again,
that's
maybe
what's
not all synthetics, because I mean there are some rare cannabinoids that might occur naturally in the plant, but occur at such low concentrations that it's commercially like impossible to actually
yes.
harvest enough cannabis. But
Mhm.
that's going to be a case by case basis. Everything else, though, I think you're better suited just sticking to what currently exists in the plant. Because again, I think most people would choose phyto delta 9 THC over whatever weird chemical analog the chemists come up with this week, rather
All
if
right.
if affordability and access were equal. I think that's the
Yeah.
key. Yeah.
Of course, that is much the key. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me again for this
Yeah,
election
happy to.
post-mortem, I'm calling it. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Until next time, this is Kimberly Simms with Regulated Roots. And thank you again to Eric for joining me for the second time here. Appreciate your time. All right. Thanks so much, everybody.